Good evening, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us for Capitol Closeout, a live conversation about how this legislative session will impact you. I'm Will Dupree here at KXAN in Austin.
And I'm Josh Hinkle, the host of the weekly statewide political program, State of Texas.
And before we begin, I just want to say anyone who's watching us on Facebook right now, if you have any questions about what's happened at the Capitol this session, leave that in the comments section, and some of our team members will work to answer those throughout the night.
Monday will mark the end of the 87th legislative session, and lawmakers came into this term facing a number of crises, including a massive budget deficit, the effects of COVID-19, and the near collapse of the state's power grid during deadly winter storms. In addition to those challenges, the Republican-controlled legislature went to work passing bills on voting, abortion, and guns, issues important to their conservative base.
And throughout it all, we have followed the contentious debates and all of the votes that have happened in between. And tonight we want to focus on the discussion about how these consequential decisions will affect you, your businesses, your communities, your schools, healthcare, and so much more.
During the next half hour or so, we'll check in with several journalists. They include Nexstar's Capitol correspondents Wes Rappaport and Maggie Glenn, along with KXAN's political reporter John Engel. We start tonight with Wes Rappaport, who joins us live outside the state Capitol. Wes, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Will. Hi, Josh. Glad to be here.
Well, let's talk about the state budget first. Lawmakers fulfilled their commitment to public education, but we will likely see funding gaps in other areas. Walk us through some of the financial winners and losers this session, Wes.
Yeah, Josh. Well, one of the key pieces of this budget was that commitment to public education, and in my conversations with some of the budget writers, they really wanted to make sure that they were able to keep their promises that they made during the previous legislative session as it related to property tax reform and school finance reform, and so one of the key pieces of that was keeping the funding levels that they had committed to before and supplementing that this time around. Also, some of the winners in this legislative session, the troopers with the Texas Department of Public Safety are expected to see pay raises after lawmakers are all done here. We are also seeing investment again in the Healthy Texas Women program. I believe that's about a $10 million increase there, and also seeing $30 billion for transportation updates. As far as some of the I guess areas or entities that may not see as fruitful financial situations after this budget, the pandemic-related cuts relating to higher education. So far, it looks like higher ed was not necessarily a winner in this budget. Budget writers, tried to make up for some pandemic-related cuts that were incurred earlier in the year and part of last year as well during this pandemic, but they just didn't fill the gap all the way. One other point I wanted to make as well is lawmakers have talked a lot about border security funding. Especially, it's a hot button issue, and it is important for a lot of Texans because of our stretch of border with Mexico. The state in this budget re-upped its commitment to border security funding, so I wanted to point that out as well.
Another topic that brought up a lot of discussion, Wes, was the winter storms that rolled through in February. They unfolded obviously during the session as it was happening and created a lot of work, additional work for the legislators for this session. A lot of people expected reforms related to that storm to happen potentially quickly. However, as a viewer noted, you can see this question from Kimberly Grazer. She asked, what bills, if any, will be passed to ensure the Texas power grid will be able to function during inclement weather? Is the legislature doing anything to make sure another disastrous power failure won't happen again? Wes, the question should be to you then, what are some of the concrete decisions that have been made related to the storm's response?
Well, it's a great question, and obviously something that impacted millions of people during this winter storm. I'll pull up my notes here, and really just to say that lawmakers and members of the energy sector really all did want to make a change after this. I think people saw what happened here at the Capitol. People from here at the Capitol saw what happened throughout the state, and made commitments to finding a fix. That said, the different fixes come in different forms. I think people were coming from different perspectives. We saw such a variety of experiences that happened. One of the I guess depending on who you ask, the fix looks a little bit different, right? So some people called for weatherization of the power grid, right? Making sure that the physical equipment and the pipes and the wires and all of the physical aspects of the state's grid would be able to withstand another storm like this, extreme conditions, whether that's hot or cold. Other people wanted to focus on the financial aspect of this, working with the market schematics, working with the different ways that energy companies and electricity retailers worked to pass the money from the consumer to those different entities. We talked a lot about different financial fixes throughout all of this. So the winter storm, of course, with overcharges as well, that we're talked a lot about during I guess the aftermath of this storm. So ultimately right now, guys, we haven't seen the final language as we wind this legislative session down. Lawmakers are still, working on the final pieces of this puzzle to make sure that they get it right for their minds, and to satisfy the governor's mandate of making sure that they do address this in some form or another as an emergency item. But I think that while we wait for lawmakers to negotiate that, just keep in mind that there were promises made, and they are working to keep their end of the deal. It's just a matter of seeing what the final language will look like. Another quick point I did want to make is that we did see a similar situation with amending the governor's powers during a pandemic, right? Lawmakers ironing out all these details that they to create a streamlined plan for future disasters. But again, they made one thing clear, and is that they want to be involved in the process. They wanted to be involved in this winter storm fix. They want to be involved in finding a fix for future pandemics and being able to help distribute money and be involved in that process. So those are two things that we will certainly be watching into the summer and fall as the details are ironed out.
As you kind of allude to, the budget process doesn't end when lawmakers gavel out. We're expecting the governor to release decisions sometime in June about line item vetoes and other vetoes possibly. Plus, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick said yesterday he'd like another special session to address conservative bills that missed deadlines. But Governor Abbott didn't really seem to support that idea, right, Wes?
Yeah, that's right. We're seeing now in the last, 3-4 days of this legislative session that back and forth between two of the state's most powerful people trying to, in a very public way, figure out how to get their priorities across the finish line. Some people in the legislature are really focused on trying to get those energy grid fixes and pandemic response fixes taken care of. Other people have other priorities, and so it's a game of chess, it's a game of checkers, it's a game of football. I mean, it is a lot. You could essentially make any sports analogy really there. It's all very calculated decisions about how to get those final pieces across the finish line. But also to keep in mind here, lawmakers will already be coming back in the fall for a special session related to redistricting, redrawing the legislative maps that happens every 10 years. Because of the pandemic, the Census Bureau delayed the release of some of that population data, and so we are still waiting for that to happen, and so lawmakers will already be coming back to address that. They'll also be looking at redistributing some federal money that will come the state's way, and the governor has committed that more lawmakers will be involved in that process. So those are kind of two of the the things that will be added to this plate, we'll see what else gets added, whether that's a special session in the summer or whether the governor will add those priorities to some of those other GOP priorities to his call during that redistricting session. But again, the governor seemingly taking that limited approach, addressing priorities kind of one at a time rather than the slate all at once. So we'll see how the summer and fall go.
Another thing that we're tracking that's upcoming are some constitutional elections. So, Wes, as this session ends, lawmakers passed on a responsibility to Texas voters that they would have to act on some things before pieces of legislation became law. What's set to happen this November?
Well, we are looking at this constitutional election that will happen in November. Again, because we're in those winding days of the session, we still don't know what all of those amendments that Texans will be able to vote for. We don't know yet what all of those are. In the meantime, we are looking at one of them is going to be a change in eligibility requirements for state Supreme Court justices and lower Texas courts. Also looking at allowing a homestead tax exemption for surviving spouses of military members who die in the line of duty. And there's also a measure that was born out of pandemic closures, Will and Josh, that would stop political entities from limiting religious services like what we saw with some church closures during this pandemic. So the full final list is still pending right now. Still, we'll see, upwards of a dozen, sometimes a few more, sometimes a few less, that Texas voters will have the opportunity to weigh in on in November.
All right, Wes Rappaport, thank you so much for joining us. We do appreciate your reporting and all your hard work this session. It's been a lot, I know, so we appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right, Josh, well, we have more issues to discuss at this time, including legislation that was passed about firearms in Texas.
That's right. Texas will soon become the largest state to allow carrying firearms without a permit. The Senate sent the legislation to the governor's desk this week. KXAN's political reporter John Engel shares reaction.
I was at church on August 3rd.
El Paso Representative Joe Moody remembers the call. A gunman had opened fire at a Walmart in town, killing 23 people. Moody joined Governor Greg Abbott in speaking with the families of victims soon after.
When the doors were closed, I heard lots of promises. I haven't heard them since.
Momentum behind gun reform that emerged from that 2019 shooting now meets the political reality in Texas.
The Republicans are in a position where they don't have to make compromises.
The state legislature is instead moving forward with fewer restrictions in an effort to make Texas a Second Amendment sanctuary state.
Even on a big issue and an emotional issue like gun control, it might not be the case that they're willing to budge because they've got a base that they have to placate.
And in a rare move, Texas's permitless carry legislation could retroactively apply to more than 130,000 criminal cases since 1974. Those with a felony conviction for unlawful carry could get their case expunged and be able to own a gun again.
Some more procedures are going to be needed. Those are going to depend on where the person's located, what the state of the records are, and what else is going on in that person's case besides this one particular conviction.
It's a fight Moody didn't expect to win, but a moment he couldn't pass up.
That tragedy will come to your community. It's come to many others' community, and it's going to come to yours too, because we fail to be responsible to the members of our communities across this state.
John Engel, KXAN News.
And joining us now live from the Capitol is John Engel. John, thank you so much for being here yet again. We appreciate that.
Of course. Thanks, Will.
We do have a question while we're on the topic of permitless carry legislation. A viewer sent this question in. Laura Denham asked, what is the thinking behind passing a gun law that allows anyone to carry a weapon without training?
It's a fair question, but it's one that's difficult to answer because it gets down to some philosophical differences between the two sides in this argument. But the conservative talking point, at least, has been that we need to have more good guys with guns and the availability for people who should legally be allowed to carry guns. And the law enforcement groups that opposed this legislation pretty much throughout the way were able to, in the 11th hour, get some provisions in there about police officers being able to secure someone's firearm if there's a public safety issue or if they have concerns about that interaction. And while those law enforcement groups are still concerned about permitless carry in Texas, it will soon be the law here. Governor Greg Abbott signaled that he would sign that bill. And again, the thinking is anyone who is that quote-unquote good guy should be able to carry a gun.
John, bills addressing local control dominated much of the session this time around. What issues saw the biggest encroachment when it comes to local control?
Yeah, absolutely, Josh. I mean, first you have to think about defunding the police, right? And that all dates back to last year when the Austin City Council voted to immediately cut $20 million from its police budget and move $130 million in services outside of police control, saying that that can be better done by civilians and doesn't need to be done by a licensed officer. And in the immediate aftermath of that vote, Republican leadership came out with as many mechanisms as they could come up with to try to stop cities from taking actions like the city of Austin did. And we saw a number of proposals come out of this session. Multiple have passed through the legislature. And what's interesting about these bills is that they're written in a way that they only impact the largest cities and counties in Texas, which we know are run by Democrats. And this all done with the blessing of Governor Greg Abbott.
John, on another topic, we saw a lot of the larger cities here in Texas struggle with increasing homeless encampments, especially here in Austin. Lawmakers passed a statewide camping ban. How does that impact the ability of cities to approach homelessness?
Well, the authors of that statewide camping ban had said that this wouldn't impact plans that were already in place in cities and that it should be looked at as a baseline approach to have a uniform set of rules across the state and that cities and counties could go a step further. But look, I mean, this is all, again, in response to the city of Austin, which had a homeless camping population here that continued to grow and was a very visible problem in the city. And these lawmakers, when they come from their communities in each part of Texas, they come here to Austin. They drive past those tent encampments. They see that on their way to the Capitol. And so this action, whether it related to their communities or not, does create a very significant baseline for how cities can approach homelessness. Now, those authors say it wouldn't change how a city approaches the issue, but it would, because now cities and counties that would want to do sanctioned campsites, designated areas where the homeless could go for either services or just a place to sleep, those would need state approval before a city or county could move forward with them. So there is state intervention here. It is not simply saying that, cities can develop their plans. They'll have to get a sign-off from the state.
We saw a lot of highly controversial legislation make it through the session this time around. Republican efforts to strengthen voting rules and essentially an all-out ban on abortions in the state. What do we expect of the overall political implications of this session, John?
Well, Josh, you know the phrase, elections have consequences, and it's cliche, but it's true. And in Texas, the most important elections, at least to date, are primary elections. So a lot of these conservative, ideologic pieces of legislation, those do pander to a conservative primary voting base, which is further to the right than your election day or early voting audience in a general election. So to think that this will have backlash, there's always a possibility of that. After the quote-unquote bathroom bill in 2017, you did see some changes in the balance of power in the state house, with Democrats picking up seats in response to that legislation in part. But this is what the primary voter on the Republican side of the ticket is looking for. So we expect this to help races, especially those down ballot ones.
As soon as this session ends, presumably campaign season kicks right off. How do you think this legislative session and all that's happened during it is going to affect those races in 2022, John?
Yeah, and looking at 2022, Governor Greg Abbott is an incredibly strong and well-funded candidate to continue leading the Republican Party, and the tailwind from that would be to help those down ballot races that we were talking about. But 2022 needs to be looked at as a primer for 24. And this legislative session is a piece of that. Governor Greg Abbott, if he still has those rumored ambitions for the White House in 24, will use these very conservative pieces of legislation as a way to market himself to the GOP primary voter. And like we said, primary elections are very important in Texas. They're still important to the party nationwide. And take a look at what the state of Florida has done. Governor Ron DeSantis there, seen by many as the potential front runner for a GOP primary ticket in 24, their legislative session looked a whole lot like Texas's legislative session so far. So when you make those comparisons and you look how this plays into the greater political conversation, this is material that Governor Greg Abbott can use to show a nationwide GOP primary voter that he's with them.
All right, KXAN's politics reporter John Engel, thank you for being here yet again, and great job for all the work you've done. I know that there's a few more days left, so I know that exemplary work will continue after that too. Thank you again.
Almost there.
Yes,
Thanks,
we
Will.
are. All right, Josh. Well, another topic that is on top of a lot of people's minds right now were the calls for criminal justice reform, especially after last summer's protests.
That's right. Texas has had several high-profile instances of police killing Black and Hispanic people in recent years. And this week, the nation, of course, was focused on the one-year mark since the murder of George Floyd. Despite those points, many of the measures in the Texas George Floyd Act have failed to progress in the legislative session. For perspective on this and the other criminal justice reform items at the Capitol, I spoke with Eric McDaniel. He's a government professor from the University of Texas at Austin.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
The portions of the legislation that progressed included provisions specific to George Floyd's death, like limiting police chokeholds and requiring officers to intervene if a fellow officer is using excessive force, but some of the most contentious provisions failed. What does this mean for the future of police accountability that after a year with so much scrutiny nationwide, this didn't sail through completely in Texas?
I wasn't expecting it to go through in Texas, given the nature of the legislature and just the general sense of Texas. It wasn't expected to go through. I think the chokehold aspect, the providing care aspect, were going to go through because they're non-controversial. But things that would put larger scrutiny on the police was not going to go through.
Mm-hmm. The legislation also had more substantive measures, like you mentioned, like taking away officers' qualified immunity, which is a legal shield that, from state civil right lawsuits. But this became a sticking point for lawmakers who stand behind police unions. And those groups argued getting rid of qualified immunity would cause police officers to quit en masse and maybe put all of the blame for misconduct on individual officers. But it really shows just how powerful the police union lobby is at the Capitol, especially when this was something that many people felt was going to be a major issue this legislative session.
Yeah, qualified immunity is kind of one of these things that even if a police officer, let's say, is found to be, they may have been in their right to do these things, they could still be punished in a civil suit. And this is somewhat like we have with laws like stand your ground. Like, you may not be charged for a legal violation, but there is still a civil suit that can be filed. This thing is really a big issue and big concern to police officers. Just like doctors have to worry about malpractice suits, now police officers have to worry about malpractice suits.
Yeah. The political conversation surrounding police reform has really shifted when the idea of change involved police funding cuts and shifting money to other social services like mental health services. Many state leaders have directed their attention at keeping police funding. And Governor Abbott even called on candidates to sign Back the Blue pledges, even making defunding an emergency item this legislative session for lawmakers to tackle. This session, it resulted in proposals which he's expected to sign that aim to stop the state's most populous areas, like Austin, from cutting police funding.
This should be expected because the state has actively worked against the urban areas, especially more liberal urban areas. So if you think about what happened with the Uber and Lyft bans, the state came through and changed all of those policies. And so you have cities like Houston, Austin, San Antonio, which are clearly to the left, and the state is clearly shifted to the right. And so the state has power to kind of supersede anything that the cities want to do. And also what they've been writing is kind of a misinformation campaign regarding what what defunding the police is about. It's not about getting rid of the police. It's about taking money for the police and putting it in other services. That way the police would not be responsible for these things because they're not equipped to handle these things.
Mm-hmm. Another measure making its way to the governor's desk, spurred by George Floyd's death, elevates criminal penalties requiring jail time for protesters who block a roadway if it prevents the passage of an emergency vehicle. What do you think about that one?
This one is interesting because one of the things about protests is you want to do something that agitates individuals where they're going to pay attention. So think of King's letter from the Birmingham jail where he explains why he participated in protest and why he was doing this. But the way by framing it around stopping an emergency vehicle allows them to say, no, while you may be allowed to protest, you cannot impede somebody from receiving emergency care. I think framing it like that, it allows people to swallow it a little bit better, but still it is a way of trying to control how people will protest.
Professor Eric McDaniel, thank you very much for your insight.
Thank you very much.
Very nice conversation there, Josh, with Professor McDaniel. We appreciate him coming in as well. While we're also talking about other topics, we cannot forget to mention the coronavirus. We are still in the COVID-19 pandemic despite increasing vaccination rates and more relaxed protective measures that the state is offering. So now let's bring in another Capitol correspondent, Maggie Glenn. She's there live outside the Capitol. Maggie, thank you so much for being here too.
Thanks for having me, Will. Glad to be here.
First up for you, what bills have more of a chance that are passing that are more direct responses to the pandemic itself?
Well, a lot of these bills that are direct responses to the pandemic are making some conveniences that we experienced during the pandemic more permanent. So, for example, that includes going to the doctor's office. During the pandemic, there were several waivers that the governor put into place that allowed you to check in with your doctor simply over your phone or through your computer from the comfort of your own couch. And so now there's a bill that is very close to becoming law that was one of the governor's priority bills that's going to be making telehealth services more accessible online more permanently. So again, that's been an interesting one to follow because the technology has been there and the support from primary care doctors has also been there. But before the pandemic, there was a lot of pushback and red tape from insurance companies. But now lawmakers have finally kind of worked a way to get that bill to appease all of the different stakeholders, and that finally has a chance of becoming law. We're also seeing a lot of mental health legislation. That's another direct response to the pandemic. Obviously, being hunkered down for so long resulted in many people, especially kids, who were stuck at home attending school online. The pandemic led to a lot of mental health disparities being highlighted, so we're seeing a lot of bills that would support funding for mental health services here in Texas.
Maggie, Democrats had high hopes heading into this session that they would finally be able to get Medicaid expansion across the finish line coming out of the pandemic. What do you think went wrong?
Right. Yeah, this is something that Democrats have been pushing for years, especially ever since the Affordable Care Act passed back almost a decade ago now. That's something that Representative John Busey has been pushing year after year. He says it's the state's biggest failure every session when they don't get it to the governor's desk. So when we talk about expansion, we're talking about the 2.2 million Texans who currently qualify under the federal guidelines, but due to state guidelines right now, they do not qualify for Medicaid assistance. So when we talk about expansion, they don't meet the 138% poverty line that they would need to meet in order to qualify for Medicaid. And so, unfortunately, yet again, there was some bipartisan support actually for the bill this session, but it never made it onto the floor, so it never even got a vote. However, there have been some other slight Medicaid expansion. That includes expansion of coverage for pregnant women on Medicaid from 2 months to 6 months. So we're seeing at least some movement, some bipartisan support of Medicaid expansion here in Texas.
While we have you, Maggie, I also want to ask about education, and this will be kind of a two-part question just to prepare you. So people are raising questions about funding for schools at both the state and the federal level. Last session, lawmakers made big commitments to Texas public schools with HB 3. First, did they follow up and keep that promise to make sure the funding was still going. And also, we want to highlight this question from a viewer really quickly. This is from Jean, and she asked, when does the education system of Texas get the federal funds sent in January? Maggie?
Yeah, so actually Wes touched on this a bit earlier with the state budget. They did keep their promise. They're still fully funding that HB 3 that passed last session, and they also have another bill, House Bill 1525, that's working to kind of just clean up some of the gaps that were there. So lawmakers are following through with their promise to keep public education fully funded. And to answer the viewer's question, the state leaders actually just about a month ago officially approved about $11.2 billion of the $18 billion in federal funding to be released to public schools. So schools are going to be seeing some of that money relatively soon. And the state leaders say that the rest of that, about $7 billion, is currently tied up behind red federal tape. So they're trying to figure out the best way to get that to our schools.
Maggie, broadband disparities became even more apparent during the pandemic with online schooling, of course. What did lawmakers do to attempt to bridge that gap for the future?
So this is something that lawmakers on both sides of the aisle were extremely passionate about this session. They passed one of the biggest bills that promises to expand broadband access across the entire state, including in rural areas, because something that people don't think about when you think about internet access, because it's not tangible, it does require physical infrastructure. So it's just like the last mile. We still need to reach these rural areas in the same way that we did, with electricity, essentially. So it's something that, when it boils down to it, it sounds extremely basic, but it's extremely needed. And in addition to that infrastructure bill, we're also seeing some push from the TEA, like you mentioned, students obviously working at home online for school. That highlighted the problem that kids in urban areas face as well. They may have access to internet, but they may not have high enough speed. They may only have one device. So the TEA is actually going to be working with lawmakers to work on a report to see exactly where these students are and try to allocate funding to help these students have better access.
One of our Next Star Capitol correspondents, Maggie Glenn there. Maggie, thank you so much again for joining us, and great job to you this session as well for all your coverage.
Thanks, guys. You too.
All right. Josh, very nice to have Maggie, Wes, and John join us for this very topical conversation as the session wraps up on Monday. We cannot touch on every single issue that there is out there that's being considered and passed into law at this point, but a lot more coverage will be happening this Sunday on State of Texas.
That's right. We'll continue breaking down the final days of the legislative session, which includes some topics on unemployment and even nursing homes on our weekly political program, State of Texas. Join us Sunday morning at 8:30 here on KXAN. And if you're outside the Austin area in Texas, check your local listings.
All right. Josh Hinkle, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. I'm Will Dupree here in the KXAN live studio in Austin. We'll see you back here at another time. Please, everyone, stay safe and healthy out there, and take care.